Good morning. Hopefully everyone had a very restful night last night. And I know I'm very, very enthused by the discussions yesterday and the very confident assertions about how many diseases we'll actually be curing in the next 100 years. But I am hopeful that all the doctors and the scientists in the world will work to find a cure for the common cold, from which I've been suffering for about a week, and it almost prevented me from being here today. So with that optimism, I apologize if I sound a bit weird. My voice is just coming back to me. But it's still a great pleasure for me to be here today. And before I begin, I'd like to thank Leonard Beleza and the entire leadership team at the Champalimaud Foundation for not only putting together this event together, but actually the most important thing, the mission of the work that you are doing. And I think the mission of the organization and the conference today have one thing in common for sure, that they're both really tackling very bold initiatives. And in keeping with the execution of the foundation's mission, you're tackling the bold undertaking of this conference in a very thoughtful manner. So thank you for your leadership for that. And I also want to thank everyone working really hard behind the scenes to make sure that our slides are in the right order, the coffee and tea at breaks is really served at the right temperature, and all of the numerous details that go into making and breaking these events are handled in perfection. So for everyone working behind the scenes, thank you so much for all of your efforts in making this event feel effortless. It takes a lot of effort to make things feel effortless. So like everyone else, when I was asked to speak here, I thought it would be actually very presumptuous and somewhat insane to stand up here in front of all of you, really brilliant people, and sound as if I know what I'm talking about in thinking forward to 100 years from today. And it almost feels arrogant a little bit to be trying to predict the future or even speculate about the future 100 years from now. But on the other hand, when I got Andrew's very polite but very persuasive emails asking me to come here, it did make me pause and think. And that's really the point of the conversations yesterday and today. It's to really make us pause and think about the long horizon and the future. It's not how accurate we are going to be about some of the things we speculate or predict, but it's really about enabling us to think about doing the right things today to set the right direction for the next 100 years, right? It's not about being right or wrong. Heck, actually, most of us will probably be dead wrong, no pun intended, in the next 100 years. So my goal today is in the next 15 minutes or so is to put some propositions in front of you that hopefully will make you think about things, that will cause you to disagree with me, that will actually enable some debate in the breaks, in the hallways, and in the bus rides as you go home, and most importantly, ask you to speculate and ponder when you have quiet time by yourself back home. So the next half century will bring very profound technological changes. And I'm a technologist and an engineer, so most of what I'm going to talk about is the role of technology and how technology will actually help us shape the next century. And we'll begin to see ideas that were once the purview of science fiction become reality in the next 100 years. We'll begin to experience near-term advances like virtual reality, augmented reality, and all-purpose robots and implantable sensors, ingestible sensors, with the futuristic possibilities of perhaps space colonization, nanobots that can perform medical procedures inside our bodies, and all of these things. But before we postulate 100 years from today, just to set the context, I want us to look back about 50 years and contrast to what the state of the technology was 50 years ago and compare it to where we are today. So in the last half a century, in the 1960s, NASA, if you can imagine, was really working on many of the engineering, physics, and computing problems, preparing to get a manned mission to the moon. And as many of us know who work in science and technology, especially in computing and other industries, that really was a watershed moment that gave rise to a lot of breakthroughs that today we take for granted. So today, many of us, and in fact, I did this morning, use USB storage devices, and many of us carry these in our pockets, in our wallets, in our purses, and the computing power in these USB devices today is more than what it took Neil Armstrong to get to the moon back in 1969. And today, every time you do a Google search, it uses more computer power than that could be dreamed of in 1965. In the 1964-65 New York's World Fair, companies back then were demonstrating technologies for the new space era, technologies like the Bell telephone system, which actually had a video call that was being made, and GE showcased the television in the World Fair in the 1960s in New York. It was the first time that the world actually saw the television. And Kodachrome technology, a company that doesn't exist anymore today, was actually depicting how real-time pictures could be taken. Today, by the way, all of those functions are captured and integrated on one device that we call a smartphone. And all of that we take for granted. We take pictures, we take videos. I saw people actually shooting videos of some of the conference that was happening here as we speak. And 50 years ago, the majority of people did not have checking accounts. Can you imagine that? And none of them had bank-issued credit cards. People actually mostly relied on cash to buy goods and pay bills. If funds had to be sent long distance, people had to go to a place called Western Union and get a money order issued, and that money order actually had to be sent via telegram to another town or country. Today, we do cash transfers and make payments through using mobile apps like Venmo and PayPal and other things. So, we're actually transferring cash and cash types of payments from our mobile devices. So glancing back 50 years and thinking about how far we have come allows us to give some credibility to what I'm going to talk about and perhaps project what might happen in the next 100 years. And now technology is a very broad topic, and I can cover many different things. But in the interest of time, I picked a few key areas where I think most profound changes will happen in the next century. So let's look at the first one of those, and that is transportation. It's my belief that transportation will profoundly change in the next 100 years. Everything from what we drive, who will drive us, and how we will move from point A to point B will change. Electric vehicles, I believe, will displace gas mobiles as the major form of transportation or major form of mobility. We'll have autonomous vehicles, hopefully fully autonomous vehicles in some form or another, and this will impact many industries like insurance and auto repair and body shop and other things. So it'll have a lot of business implications in addition to just technological implications and how we move about. We'll be able to predict traffic. There'll be software that will be developed, and hopefully not just predicting traffic jams, but perhaps hopefully avoiding traffic jams. And just to make sure we don't think this is so far out, already there's work going on, and IBM recently demonstrated that using sensors and data gathering algorithms, they were able to predict a traffic jam 2 hours before it occurred. So it's not that far out to think about where we are today in 100 years, how far this might take us. And by the way, this is, I am an optimist, and I work in technology and I create technology, so this is an optimistic view, but it's also a very uplifting view to think about people who are not able to drive, perhaps not being needing to drive, because computers will actually take them from one point to another and be a much safer, better way for us to be transporting ourselves from point A to point B. The second area that I think will profoundly change our lives and change humanity is robotics. And we've kind of touched on this in many different ways through various panelists. But I think the most important thing about robotics is when we think about robotics, it generates a fear in us. Most of the questions I get when I'm talking about robotics is, will it take our jobs away? Will it create more unemployment? And I think actually there's a positive view to robotics, which we are just beginning to research, and that is the biomimicry. Having machines actually help us do things better. Today robotics is still in a very basic form. It's mostly trained, robots are mostly trained to pick apart from here to there and place parts and move parts and help us with manufacturing. But think about robotics perhaps in nursing and different fields like that. And as the population ages, and hopefully somebody will figure out how to, I heard yesterday that on an average, we believe in the next 100 years, life expectancy will go up to 105 to 120 years. That's actually a scary thought for me. But then hopefully we'll have robots taking care of us. And they'll be not only reliable, but actually teachable. And one of the other things that will happen is how the humans and machines interface will also change and become more natural in the future. And there is actually already work that's being done here. Engineers in Purdue University are taking this one step further and working on today for robots to help in surgery and other fields like that. So it's not that far away to think about that future. The next is connected bodies, related. And I think, in 100 years from now, we'll look back at the wearables that we have today and think how quaint they are. Imagine wearing a silly band on top of around your wrist to keep track of your footsteps, right? That's what people 100 years from now will say about the wearables that we think are very cool today and spend hundreds of dollars for iPhones and things of this, iWatches, and other things like this, right? Because any wearable today is very much after the fact. It'll tell you whether you walked 10,000 steps in a day or not after the day is over. And after a week or so, that information becomes less useful to you because I know if I went to the gym and if I worked out, I'll get my steps. And if I didn't, I don't have my steps. So really, the point of having a wearable is not that useful today. But going forward, it'll be more about not just wearables, but things inside our body that will keep track of what's happening in our body real time and send that vital information to our doctors and people that can help us live a better lifestyle. So it'll really be about ingestible sensors and perhaps having technology that will be more embedded in our body, which brings up a question that we were asking earlier about redefining humanity and redefining what it means to be human when parts of us will perhaps be digitally augmented. By the way, this is also something that scientists are already working on. They're actually trying to find a way to measure heart rate and respiration rates, et cetera, in real time within our body. And the big question, though, is the technology might advance, but how quickly will the medical field adopt certain things like this? The next is the influence of this on medical technology, and we talked again a little bit yesterday in Dr. Horwitz's talk about some ways technology will help us be leading us to more precision medicine and preventative care, et cetera. But the one thing we didn't talk about so far is 3D printing. And 3D printing today is mostly being used for spare parts in manufacturing. Many manufacturers, if you think about the amount of cost that's involved in moving and shipping parts from point A to point B, we are using 3D printing today. 100 years from now, we'll definitely be 3D printing live organs that can be transplanted. And so people that are now waiting for organ transplants and perhaps lose their life for that will be able to print organs for them and transplant them. And again, exciting thing here is research is already going on. And what I found this to be fascinating, that the researchers in the University of Washington are able to reconstruct the genome of a fetus using saliva from the father and the blood sample from a mother. So think about this, right? And this will actually lead to, if we can bring the cost down, which I'm sure we will be able to. One thing with technology is, with the usage, the cost of technology always comes down. So in 100 years from now, we'll probably be able to actually use many non-invasive prenatal testing techniques to improve the health of the babies before they're born. Which leads me to the next topic, which is the Internet of Everything. So in 100 years from now, we'll not only be connecting people, but we'll actually be connecting devices. And I used to work at Cisco, and our research says that there'll be 100 billion connected devices in just the next 10 years, by 2025. So it's not just about connectivity, and we talked a lot about big data, but I actually have an opposite view. It's not really big data the value is actually from small data. It's how you actually use that data in a specific application or a specific vertical. All that we've done as technologists up until this point is collect data and store data because storage costs have come down. But what do we do with all this data? And that's the real question, and which is what we will be working on in the next 100 years or so. We'll actually be able to leverage all of the data from the sensors and from people and hopefully provide better insights, which leads us to the next thing, which is contextual knowledge. Being able to use information in the context of what that information will be needed and be providing the right kind of answers, right? It's not just digitizing books, but what do you need that information? Once it's digitized, it's searchable. Information is searchable. Once it's searchable, you can ask the right questions. So one of the things we'll have to train people in the future is not necessarily to go look for answers, but to ask the right questions so that the right answer can be provided to you from the computing or the information database that's going to exist in the future. And along with this, imagine the whole entire population of the planet coming online. And this is happening. I mean, we talked a little bit yesterday about the digital divide and what happens to people that don't have access to information. And the question you asked about Africa, and is Africa going to come online? The good news is companies are already working on that. You know, companies like Qualcomm and Facebook and Cisco and IBM, all companies, global companies, have efforts to provide connectivity at a lower cost to many of the people around the world. And these people that are coming online and will be coming online in the next 100 years are not coming online at the speeds that we came online. Even my generation came online. But they're going to come online with at least 1 megabits per second connectivity, which means they're going to have access to crowdsourcing, cloud computing, Internet of Everything, all of this. So information is going to be really available to everyone in a very unique way, so that there'll be a lot more room in the future for contextual knowledge and the power of knowledge. And the next thing that I anticipate a profound change, not just in the way we produce things, but actually the distribution, is food. Food is also a problem as well as an opportunity for us. If we think about this between now and 2050, the world's population will increase quite dramatically, and you can read the numbers up there. Along with that, though, the amount of food that we are producing and the resources that we are using to distribute the food is constrained. So we have to really think very creatively about food production and distribution in a more environmentally astute way. And I live in California, and for the last 4 years, we've had a very severe drought, and we can actually feel it even in the neighborhoods that we live in. And so for us, we really need to start working on this problem now. And perhaps in the next 100 years, we'll have farm scrapers, not just skyscrapers to host people and house people, but the way to produce food. Just even as I speak, in Chicago, there is a company, a startup outside the city of Chicago that's already working on this. And it is a company called GreenSense, and it's a vertical farm that produces food inside a building, inside of a farm scrape. So you can envision in 100 years, hopefully, that we'll actually be building cities in a different way and maybe go back to having locally sourced food that will be grown in the buildings that we will live, kind of sort of back to the future almost, which will be a good thing, but in a different way than it was. So just to summarize, I think if I were to predict or speculate or have you think about or have you disagree with me, depending on what your perspective, in the next 100 years, I expect that our physical mobility, the way we move things, people and goods, will fundamentally change. It'll be safer, better, faster, much more environmentally conscious, much more accident-free, much more traffic that will be managed in a proactive way. Machines will become our caregivers, so they'll become a very integral part of how we live. They won't be just wasting our time like we talked about yesterday about email, but perhaps they can be a constructive part of our lives and the constructive parts of actually even our families. A family unit, perhaps, in the future will not just be humans, but humans plus a robot, right? Which brings us to the bad word or the S word of singularity, and what does it mean to singularity. And there's very opposing views on singularity, whether we'll ever reach it or not reach it. But regardless of whether we reach singularity or convergence, some kind of a convergence in 100 years, we will definitely have machines be an integral part of what we do. The one thing I do want to say is perhaps in the next 100 years, we will actually see a global financial meltdown or some kind of a collapse of multiple nation states that will be driven by a cyber attack, just as we are fighting terrorism today. It's very likely that the next 100 years will bring us to some kind of a cyber attack. But maybe the positive or the optimistic way of looking at it, perhaps that'll be a wake-up call for us to be really paying more attention to cyber attacks, because we don't know what we don't know. As we're creating technologies, we're also expanding the surface area for attacks and vulnerability. And today, it's a mere annoyance. When you have a DDoS attack and you can't access your Facebook page or your music service is disrupted, you're irritated. But in the future, when you have power grids and all of these be digitized, it'll be a much more serious issue. But perhaps that'll be a wake-up call for us as human beings and even for politicians to be really thinking about what does it mean to have cyber attacks. I talked about our bodies being much more digitally enhanced and food that will be locally sourced and taking us back into the future. I want to end with this poem. Looks like today is the day for poems that I found, and it's attributed to someone called Forrest Whitcraft, who was a teacher, a scholar, and the head of Boy Scouts. And it goes like this: 100 years from now, it won't matter what car I drove, what kind of house I lived in, how much I had in my bank account, nor what my clothes looked like. But the world may be a little better because I was important in the life of a child. I think the opportunity is in front of us today to start teaching our children not just about the technology and the possibilities of technology, but really not to stop their search for humanity. I think at the end, it all comes down to what does it mean being human, and how do we teach our children not to lose humanity as they start using technologies and developing technologies. With that, I would like all of you to be welcome to the next century. Thank you.